You know, a lot of the nuclear renaissance, Mary Beth, is just whistling past the graveyard. They have talked and talked and talked and generated reams and reams of paper, gotten money from ratepayers to generate reams and reams of paper, but you notice that they haven't yet ordered a nuclear power plant. 50 years after the first so-called commercial nuclear power plant went online in Shippingport, Pennsylvania, they're still hat in hand in Washington asking for subsidies. The industry itself has said without loan guarantees there'll be no renaissance. The nuclear power is still very costly. And the issue of global warming is, should we apply scarce resources to nuclear power, which is going to generate a lot of headaches for us, and give them extra money and subsidies, or should we go with clean energy sources and efficiency? I don't believe actually that there is going to be a nuclear renaissance, because the nuclear industry is really either tied to the government it's doing it, like, you know, the French have a nuclear socialism. Électricité de France was 100% government-owned utility, and they took the French electricity sector from very low nuclear percentage in the early 70s to 80%, nearly 80% nuclear electricity in 25 years or so. They did that because they had access to easy credit, government funds, and they even did plutonium fuel, and the plutonium fuel separation company was a government-owned company, Kojima. It cost them 2 cents extra for every kilowatt hour to use plutonium as fuel to generate, I think, less than 10% of their electricity. But they did it. And I have a document showing that Électricité de France said, this is going to be expensive and maybe we shouldn't do it, but it will throw the whole nuclear enterprise into question. This is a paraphrase. If we now say we're not going to do it, this is from 1989. So they wasted the ratepayers' money because there's no public utility commission, there's nobody to stop them from simply raiding the ratepayers' pocketbook. So I think there's a little bit more checks and balances in this country, and I don't think they'll be able to raid the pocketbook for too long. So just on its own, I think this whole nuclear renaissance is really wishful thinking. The nuclear industry was saying, oh, we need 300 nuclear power plants to, you know, address global warming. The MIT study said that, for instance. And now they're saying maybe they can get 45 built by 2030. Well, 45 nuclear power plants isn't going to cut it. It's not worthwhile to create all those problems to build 45 nuclear power plants. So I don't think there's going to be a nuclear renaissance. Fearless prediction.
Well, be that as it may, there is all now, I think, going to be on the ballot in California in this next primary election. They're trying to roll back the California law that says you can't build new plants until you get a solution for the waste problem.
Let me put a caveat on that. We won't have a nuclear renaissance unless we have nuclear socialism. You know, loan guarantees, government subsidies, easy licenses, a rolling back of checks and balances, making it very hard for interveners to intervene in licensing proceedings to help review safety. If we do all of those things, you know, if we pave their way to a new nuclear power plant with gold and continue doing that, you know, we'll get lots of nuclear power plants. On their own, if there are no loan guarantees and the big subsidies are taken away, there will be no new nuclear power plants. I'm not saying that will happen automatically. I'm saying we have a big fight ahead of us to make sure that they don't raid the public pocketbook, because they cannot stand on their own. That's what I mean by, you know, I guess I kind of overstated it when I said there will be no nuclear renaissance. I mean, there will be no the industry cannot produce a nuclear renaissance in the energy marketplace. That's the more accurate way to say it.
So you'd agree with Levin's old statement that the nuclear industry is already dead from an overdose of market forces?
Well, that is, I think, the main thing that killed the nuclear industry, or at least made it dormant in the first place. The growth rate of electricity went down in the mid to late 70s, and then they ran into all these financial problems with high interest rates and ratepayer revolts. And the main thing, I think, that made nuclear power go down is the bond default on the reactors in Washington State, the project they call WPPS, W-P-P-S, the Washington State Public Power Supply System. And when there was that default, Chemical Bank, which used to be a very big New York bank, went under as well. A lot of little old ladies in their tennis shoes lost their safe investments in utility bonds. And Wall Street does not like its own to go under. And so nuclear power has been seen as a high-risk enterprise by Wall Street. And that's why they want government loan guarantees. Actually, Standard & Poor's, which, as you know, is a credit rating firm, has said that something to the effect that even if they did get loan guarantees, that a company that ordered a nuclear power plant, their credit rating would tend to go down. So, and on their own, that's why the utilities are not trying to raise money and order power plants, is because any company that orders a power plant without these loan guarantees and without money in the pipeline for the federal government, their whole credit rate, their ability to borrow for their non-nuclear side would go down. It'd become more expensive. They'll become less competitive across the front of their business. So it's just not in the nuclear part of the enterprise that they would be affected. So that's why Wall Street is the major player in this. I think Wall Street can see that Yucca Mountain is in a mess, that there is no solution to the problem of nuclear waste, that the Department of Energy has defaulted on its promises, that the nuclear energy is in a position of having to sue the federal government to recover just the costs of nuclear waste storage on site. There are terrorism risks with nuclear power and spent fuel storage. And I think Wall Street correctly sees nuclear power, especially now more than before, as a very risky enterprise. And I have to say that, even leaving aside the proliferation risks, just focusing on the domestic forces of cost, terrorism, severe accidents, and financial risk, there are a lot of places to put your money. Why would you go there? Wall Street sees nuclear power as a big risk. So we have the financial risk. They take a long time to build. They're very vulnerable to changes in interest rates. If interest rates go up, as they did in the 80s, that's one of the reasons nuclear power plants skyrocketed. They're very vulnerable to regulatory issues. If there's delays, their costs go up more than other types of power plants. You can put up a wind power plant in a year and a half, from start of construction to finish generating power. So that's not a very big risk. You can see the result fast. Similarly for solar photovoltaic plant. You can do those quickly. So the financial risk is very great. The regulatory risks are significant. And then you've got the risk of accidents. So 3 Mile Island, even if you accept the establishment's view that 3 Mile Island did not produce severe health effects, suppose you accept that view. The Wall Street view, looking at that, as somebody quite famous has said, I think a former commissioner, is that the lesson of 3 Mile Island is you can go from a $2 billion asset into a $1 billion liability in the space of 24 hours. That's what nuclear power, that's one of the financial vulnerabilities of nuclear power. Then you got the vulnerability of waste. The DOE has done a bad job. They've got to store the waste on site. They have to go to court now to recover money from the DOE because the DOE has not fulfilled its promises to take the waste away. They were supposed to do that in January, beginning in January 1998, and they're not going to begin for at least 10 years if Yucca Mountain works, and I doubt that Yucca Mountain is going to work. Even within their own framework, they still don't have regulations for under which they can dispose off the waste. Just so you have a perspective on how long the EPA started making regulations for high-level waste repository in the early 1980s. It's been a quarter of a century, and we still do not have regulations for disposing of spent fuel at Yucca Mountain. Because they have regulations for high-level waste, but they don't apply to Yucca Mountain. So that's a very big risk. You have terrorism risks because then you have to store spent fuel for prolonged periods at the site. So you have multiple risks, even leaving aside the international proliferation risks. You have huge risks that could cause an investor to lose their money and turn their assets into a liability in a short period of time. So why would an investor want to put their money into nuclear power when they have so many other places they can put their money and make a good return?
Oh, I hope they think like you do, Arjun.
They do. I think that's why they do think like me. In fact, I'm just telling you what I read in the Wall Street literature, that nuclear power is a big risk. We're not going to finance them. Their credit rating would go down if they do order a nuclear power plant. That's exactly why the CEO of Duke Energy himself has opined. They have said, their CEOs and captains of the nuclear industry have said, without loan guarantees, we can't do this, because they know they cannot go to Wall Street and raise the money. So I'm in this role, I can just be a neutral observer and report to you what I'm reading.
But isn't there now a push in Congress to, in fact, supply those loan guarantees?
Yes, there is a push in Congress to supply 100% loan guarantees. The loan guarantees could run into tens of billions of dollars. They would cover, a dozen or 2 dozen power plants. I think, as I said before, we would have a French-style nuclear socialism, a raid on the taxpayers and ratepayers' pocketbook, because some states are proposing all kinds of guarantees. If your plant is not complete, you can recover from the ratepayers. If your plant has cost overruns, you can recover from the ratepayers. So they're trying to shift the risk. So this is sort of, it has nothing to do with capitalism, right? You shift the risk from investors onto the public, but the profit goes to the investors. So the people who take the risk, which is the ratepayers, won't see the profit. The people who don't face the risk at all will see profits, even if they do a bad job. So this is not capitalism in any textbook that I've ever read, or even remotely in practice.
But since they just did such a criminal application of non-capitalistic tactics with Enron and just not even, it wasn't even nuclear, with the utilities,
Yes.
In California we were stuck with we were just totally defrauded. We were held up by these utility companies, and now people are being very confused by the PR that so not only are did people never really truly understand what happened to them in the past, now they're being inundated with the message that nuclear is a good idea.
Well, I think the California public especially should be wary. I'll try to say right what President Bush had a little difficulty with. Fool me once, shame on you. Fool me twice, shame on me. And I think Californians especially should be wary of PR from the energy industry. I think California was a leader in the late 1970s, 1978, if I believe, that spent fuel is an economic issue. We have a right to regulate economic issues. They settle that problem with the federal level, with the federal government, and they earned that right. To throw away a right that you earned and forget the lessons of the past, despite the fact that history has shown them, subsequent events have shown them to be completely right, that this waste problem is really very difficult. And in the hands of the Department of Energy, whose technical track record in the last quarter century is horrendous, and whose cost overruns are beyond, anything that would be considered reasonable. So Yucca Mountain, underperforming, license application not made, late, contracts abrogated, and no Yucca Mountain in sight as yet. The waste project at the Savannah Riverside, it was supposed to open in 1995. So I can give you a whole catalog of big projects by the Department of Energy that have not only had huge cost overruns, 2 times, 3 times, 4 times, but also either not performed or underperformed with major failures. So Yucca Mountain not performed yet. The vitrification plant in Savannah Riverside and the processing of high-level wastes for safe storage, a large part of that project was written off after 16 years, $500 million down the hole. 10-year delay, those problems are still not solved, more money down the hole. So,
for those people who don't understand what Yucca Mountain is short for,
yes.
Can you please explain what Yucca Mountain is supposed to do?
Yes. In 1982, there was a law passed that was called the Nuclear Waste Policy Act. Under this law, the used nuclear fuel, the highly radioactive material that results from putting fuel in a reactor, it's so radioactive that when you take it out of a reactor, my friend Michio Kaku used to give this analogy that if Evel Knievel went 60 miles an hour on his motorcycle from one end to the other of fuel rods, before he got to the other end, he would be dead of the radiation. That's how radioactive these things are when they're first withdrawn from the reactor. That's why they have to be stored underwater. These rods have plutonium in them, to 1% plutonium. The rest of it is fission products and uranium. In order to kind of lessen the proliferation risk, that is, somebody will go and get the plutonium and separate it and make bombs out of it, and also deal with the festering issues of accidents on site and so on, they created this repository program. They would basically create a deep mine called the Deep Geologic Repository and put the nuclear waste in there in containers and select a site where the nuclear waste would stay put or not go very far for tens of thousands or hundreds of thousands of years. And this is called the Geologic Isolation Program, even though it is known that the waste would kind of leak out and eventually reach the human environment. But the idea was they wouldn't reach the human environment for hundreds of thousands of years. They were supposed to do a comparative program of comparing an eastern site to a western site and a bunch of western sites between each other to select a good place and have good science as the main criterion. But in 1987, they decided to just explore one site in Yucca Mountain, Nevada, not about 80 or 90 miles northwest of Las Vegas. And it was a blatantly political decision. People in Nevada call it the Screw Nevada Bill. And so there was nothing to compare it to. In my opinion, Yucca Mountain is the single worst repository site that was ever examined or explored in the United States. But it was politically weak, so they picked it. Now they're in trouble because the senior senator from Nevada is the majority leader of the U.S. Senate, so they're not so weak anymore. So they've now got a political problem they didn't anticipate.
And why is it bad science from the science point of view?
Well, a geologic repository should accomplish a few things. First of all, the geologic setting, the rock itself, should ideally absorb the radioactive material. So if they leak out of the containers, they'll stick to the rock. and they won't get into the water. So the geology of Yucca Mountain is practically useless by the department's own calculations. So if you look at their calculation of which element of the isolation system will really work to contain the waste, it's just the canister. And if it leaks out of that canister, it will reach the groundwater. So that's one problem. The geology itself is useless. The second is Nevada, of course, famously has very little water, especially that part of Nevada, Las Vegas and north of there. So the groundwater, local groundwater, is the only usable resource that they have, and there's not very much of it. So if you got radiation leaking into the groundwater, since there's not very much, it'll become very contaminated, and anybody who uses it will get high doses of radiation. So it's very difficult actually to foresee that you can have reasonable radiation norms within what we call presently reasonable, what we use for radiation protection, say from nuclear power plants or refineries and so on, other nuclear enterprises today. So that's one of the reasons they cannot create a standard that would apply to Yucca Mountain where they can say, yeah, we've done a good job of protecting future generations.
And how fast does it leak out of the canister?
Well, that's the other problem with Yucca Mountain. So Yucca Mountain has got this porous rock known as volcanic tuff. Volcanic tuff is an oxidizing environment. That it's got little pores that are full of air, and this air is slightly humid. So it's got oxygen and humidity. The canisters are to be made of metal. Oxygen, humidity, heat, and the waste is hot, and metal are a well-known formula for rust. So rust can be slow or fast depending on, other geologic conditions. So if you look at laboratory results, how fast has the metal rusted? And the answer is between decades and tens of thousands of years. So we don't really know how long these canisters would last. And in order to actually find out, you would have to do decades of research. And they've been rushing this thing, saying, we already know it's good, when the evidence is all over the map. So they've tried to fix it with computer programs that are almost unfathomable, that show wonderful performance. But even that wonderful performance is not enough to meet elementary radiation protection norms. That's why they're having so much problem. So by every criterion, whether it's protection of water, the geology of the site, is the site compatible with the containers, do we know a lot about the containers, Yucca Mountain is a total failure. And I think you would probably do better by sticking a pen on a map blindfolded. Maybe that's an excessive statement. You could do as well anyway.
Well, yeah, and then there's been a lot of earthquake activity. There's a lot of water.
Yes, there are many faults at the site. There is humidity. The infiltration into the site is bigger than originally thought. So the climate change issues for the repository could be quite significant. They have tried to take some of these things into account. I won't say that all the science that has been done around Yucca Mountain is bad. I know some scientists who've worked on Yucca Mountain. They're very fine scientists. A lot of people have done some very good work. But because there's this pressure that this has to be the site, this has to be certified, they've run into a lot of things, some fabrication of quality control data, and they've had a lot of problems at the management level and at the level of institutional integrity, of really informing the public of what is going on, because it really is not a good site. So if they let all the science come up to the top so the public can see it all in non-jargony terms. I'll give you an anecdote, okay, about this, my own personal experience. So I've long studied Yucca Mountain, and the National Academy of Sciences impanels committees to look into various aspects when the DOE asks them under the National Research Council. So I got a call once from a staffer saying, will you come and give us a talk about the stages of repository development? So I said, I don't really want to come. You all never refer to my work or listen to me, so I think it's a waste of my time to come and make a presentation to you. And this staff person was very persuasive, and she said, we really will listen to you. You know, I think this committee really needs your input. They're right here in Washington, D.C. So after having played hard to get, I agreed to go. So I did. I decided to really provoke this distinguished group of scientists just to see what would happen. Provoke them with good scientific information, but very bluntly put. So I said that Yucca Mountain does not meet a sophomore test of good physics. That is the wrong. What you're trying to do there is contrary to the second law of thermodynamics. So this is something that every physicist understands and knows. And in other words, I've already explained, you're putting a metal container in an oxidizing environment. You should be putting a metal container in a reducing environment, the kind that makes gold nuggets. You know, there are environments in which you can find gold nuggets. Those are reducing environments that form metal naturally, so that if you put metal in those environments, it'll tend to last. Then I said, you haven't thought through the human intrusion problem. There's as good an argument to put high-level nuclear waste under a big city as there is to put it in a remote area. Because in a remote area, people forget about it, and then intruders could dig into it and get at the plutonium. But if you first put it under a big city, I said it half jokingly, you know, because obviously it's a very big risk to put nuclear waste under a big city. But for the long term, people wouldn't be digging through a big city 3,000 feet under. And so I presented this one thing after another that's wrong with the present program, especially Yucca Mountain. And I made a 20-minute presentation or so, and there was this really stunned silence at the end. I said, you have no questions? I've just made the most provocative statement to you that Yucca Mountain is a really horrible project that doesn't meet the test of sophomore science in a university, and you have no answer, no question. You're not going to challenge me. You're not going to talk. So somebody said, well, the Swedes are putting a metal container in their repository program. And I said, well, the Swedes have a reducing environment, because their environment will tend to preserve metal. Yucca Mountain will tend to corrode metal. So I think the Swedes have a much better program than we do. And then there was this other long silence. So there's a fundamental... Yucca Mountain should never have been picked as a repository site. If you look at the National Academy study of 1983, which was funded by the DOE, and say which is the site at which the National Academy, National Research Council itself, calculated the highest radiation doses to the public, it was at Yucca Mountain, because Yucca Mountain has no dilution and only groundwater, and no surface water to go to that people could go to if groundwater got contaminated. And yet, they picked Yucca Mountain. I've often asked the DOE, you funded this study, haven't you read it? And I've never really gotten an answer. A geologic repository program should contain the waste in the containers. If the containers leak, it should contain the waste in the rock. It should stick to the rock. You should have ample other resources to go to so that you're not depending on the resource that would be polluted. And Yucca Mountain doesn't meet any of these tests. And you've got containers that are like may well corrode under the circumstances. The geology is not good, and the water resources are very scarce. So you've got a situation in which future generations, you know, hundreds, thousands, tens of thousands of years from now are likely to get radiation doses from this. We don't know the time. It will be a long time in the future. The connection between nuclear power and nuclear weapons has long been known. And in 1946, in the immediate aftermath of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, there was a lot of talk about a nuclear weapons convention, a treaty that would ban nuclear weapons. And the United States had proposed something like that in the United Nations. Part of the proposal was that the U.S. would retain nuclear weapons until they were sure that nobody else had them, and then the U.S. would get rid of theirs. And so that's why it never went anywhere. The Russians didn't like it. But apart from that, J. Robert Oppenheimer, who was the scientific director of the Manhattan Project and the leading scientist among the nuclear weapons advisors in the aftermath of the war, he wrote that, quote, "We know very well what we would do if we signed such a convention. We would not make atomic weapons, at least not to start with, but we would build enormous plants and we would call them power plants. Maybe they would produce power. We would design these plants in such a way that they could be converted with the maximum ease and the minimum time delay to the production of atomic weapons, saying, this is just in case somebody 2 times us. We would stockpile uranium. We would keep as many of our developments secret as possible. We would locate our plants not where they would do the most good for the production of power, but where they would do the most good for protection against enemy attack." And so you can recognize that the Iranians, for instance, inciting their uranium enrichment underground and hiding things, have taken a leaf from Oppenheimer's book. The North Koreans have. I don't know if they've read Oppenheimer, maybe not. But certainly it's the same kind of thinking. A lot of countries now are thinking, well, if the nuclear weapon states are going to retain their nuclear power capability. The Iraq War has been a big wake-up call. Saddam Hussein did not have nuclear weapons. North Korea did have nuclear weapons. And the outcomes in the 2 cases for the countries, both horrible dictatorships, have been very different. The U.S. is dealing with the one and crushed the other, even though the Saddam Hussein dictatorship was an ally of the United States at one time. The lesson that many countries appear to be taking is it's at least important to have nuclear weapons capability. And they can't say that under the NPT. They're all signatories to the NPT.
Which is?
The Non-Proliferation Treaty that was signed in 1968 and went into effect in 1970 says that the 5 countries that were nuclear weapon states at the time would eventually negotiate to get rid of their weapons, and that none of the other signatories would acquire them or try to acquire them. But in return, they would have, quote, the inalienable right, unquote, to acquire commercial nuclear power and other nuclear technology, civilian nuclear technology. So since they have this inalienable right to commercial nuclear technology, they now want to exercise it. But in my reading of global affairs, the main intent seems to be to acquire, or one of the principal intents seem to be to acquire the infrastructure of nuclear technology, such as what Oppenheimer was talking about, so that it could be converted to nuclear weapons. The Japanese, for instance, have commercial nuclear technology, and they are talking about using that for making nuclear weapons. Ichiro Ozawa, the leader of their Labor Party, explicitly said that in 2002, that we should consider that, especially in relation to China if they become too powerful. That's a paraphrase. I think the Gulf Cooperation Council, which consists of Saudi Arabia and other Persian Gulf countries, pointing to Iran and Israel, said, we are openly acquiring nuclear power. It is not a threat. Our intentions are entirely peaceful. But they were pointing to Iran and Israel's nuclear weapon program in making this announcement. There was no need to do that, I think, if the underlying intent is not to demonstrate some kind of military capability.
And so do you think that that's what happened in the United States?
No, in the United States, the Manhattan Project was exclusively a nuclear weapons program. Until North Korea, nuclear weapons programs did not really arise centrally out of nuclear power programs. Some of them were helped by the Atoms for Peace program, which was President Eisenhower's program to promote civilian nuclear technology. The Atoms for Peace program dates to 1954, end of 1953, which was essentially the message of the NPT. If you'll be good and not acquire nuclear weapons and go along with the United States, we will help you with commercial nuclear technology, which will solve all your problems. It will be too cheap to meter. You remember that it was really a propaganda campaign about nuclear power, but really to keep the United States on top in terms of nuclear weapons. And they called it propaganda then. That's not a word that I'm putting into their mouths. This is, some of the leaders used the word propaganda to describe what they were doing at the time and what they wanted at the time with respect to the Soviets. American atom, peaceful, Soviet atom, military. That was how they wanted to arrange affairs. But so India did use some Atoms for Peace facilities for its nuclear weapons capability. Pakistan also. But centrally, the commercial nuclear power until now has not been an engine of proliferation. The US, of course, not. The Soviets, not. The French and British built reactors, but they were primarily for military purposes, although they generated some power. The Chinese didn't have nuclear power. Their program was military. The Israelis, not. The North Koreans were really the first to convert a power-producing reactor and reprocessing plant and divert it for weapons purposes openly. And the Iranians, of course, are building a uranium enrichment plant, claiming commercial intent. And in fairness, they have not discovered any weapons intent as yet, despite many inspections. But I think the message is very clear. The infrastructure is the same. And so this is why I say it's taking a leaf from Oppenheimer's book. You don't have to say it's a nuclear weapons plant. You can call it a power plant. You can build it as a power plant, and maybe it would produce power, or maybe it would produce commercial uranium. But everybody knows that you can convert it to nuclear weapons use. That's what is really new in the last 10, 15 years, is nuclear power infrastructure is becoming a demonstration of nuclear weapons capability, and nobody has to say that they have that. Everybody knows it.
So really, this has become a pretext for invading Iran to cover the fact that probably the real motivation is to get control of the oil, isn't that what you say?
Well, I don't know what Alan Greenspan is currently saying in private about what the motivation for invading Iran might be. But I think that regime change in Iran has been on the U.S. agenda since the Islamic Revolution in 1979. The Islamic Revolution was a very big blow to the U.S. control of that region, because the Shah was really the anchor of the U.S. control of the region. And the Iranian nuclear program started under the Shah. Most people do not know that he was encouraged by the West to start a nuclear program. The United States and Germany and France, they wanted to sell him reactors. He actually had orders for 20 reactors, even though he had more oil then. You know, they say, well, why does Iran need nuclear reactors? They've got so much oil. Well, they had even more oil back then because they pumped a bunch since then. They not only wanted to sell Iran reactors, that's when the current reactor that is being completed by the Russians was started by Siemens of Germany. And then after the revolution, it was never completed. And the Russians are completing it at that same site. The Iranians had a joint company for uranium enrichment with the French, in which they put a lot of money. They had orders for 20 reactors with advance payments to the United States. I don't remember if all 20 were with the United States. Kissinger and company. and wanted to make Iran the Middle East center of plutonium separation, and who would supply commercial plutonium to the various other Middle Eastern countries, because Iran, of course, was this wonderful island of the greatest stability and the most westernized state in the region, and the closest ally of the United States. And so, and we have all these documents. Maybe you should film some of them. You know, they're very interesting, with Mr. Kissinger's signature, and you know. And then the revolution happened only a short few years later, and the Iranians actually then tried to acquire uranium enrichment capability openly in 1982 by approaching the International Atomic Energy Agency, which is their right under the treaty, and the U.S. kind of pushed that, made that not happen. They didn't allow it to go forward. And so the Iranians actually clandestinely and in violation of the treaty acquiring uranium enrichment capability has something to do with the West preventing them from acquiring it openly and exercising their treaty rights. So since they were prevented from doing it openly, they did it secretly. It's not justified for them to do it secretly, but it wasn't justified to prevent them from doing it openly either, in my opinion.
Okay, let's move on to your forthcoming book and its premise and its conclusion.
Well, my new book is Carbon-Free and Nuclear-Free, a roadmap for U.S. energy policy. And I'm really very excited about it. It started a year ago at Helen Caldicott's Energy Conference, and my former boss from the 70s, S. David Freeman, who saved California from the energy crisis just a few years ago, right? He organized the supply of electricity. And he gave a talk saying we should really get rid of coal and nuclear and go to a solar energy future. And I said, Dave, you're going to send every industry we have to China. This is too expensive. It can't be done. And I was not thinking of carbon-free and nuclear-free future. And he said, why don't you stop being a naysayer and help us figure out how we can make this happen? And why don't you just take a look? And I really deeply respect Dave. He's really the father of energy policy in this country, from the late 60s and early 70s, before the first energy crisis. And he really should be honored for having that vision back then. And so out of respect for Dave and Helen also agreed. I took a look and I thought, there's a technological revolution going on that I wasn't aware of. And I agreed to do this book. And I now think that I have shown that it is technically possible to eliminate nuclear power and fossil fuels in 30 to 50 years, depending on the policies, how lucky we get on some research, how fast we can bring some things to market. But it is possible to do it, even with some bad luck and some stumbles and many things not working out as we think they might, to do it in 50 years. And I think if we do things right, we can do it faster in 30 to 40 years.
And that's 100% replacement of the fuel, of the fossil fuel and nuclear fuel at today's consumption rate?
No, I think our economy is really extremely inefficient, although we think of it as very efficient. We know, of course, that cars get 25 miles per gallon, but let me put to you that cars are actually only 1% efficient. 99% of the gasoline is wasted. Here's how I do the calculation. Car engines are about 15% efficient, but they're moving 3,200 pounds of metal. The object is not to move metal from one place to another, it's to move people from one place to another. So if you count the weight of the people that we move, it's only 1 pound and 15 of the total weight of the vehicle is the people. So the overall transportation efficiency is only 1%. Ordinary incandescent light bulbs only give you 1% of the coal or nuclear energy that was put into the power plant as light. The other 99% is wasted. Even compact fluorescent bulbs, which we think are very efficient, give you 4%. 96% of the energy is wasted. 2/3 of the power plant and 1/3 of that at the house in the form of heat. That drives up your air conditioning in the summer. So we know how to make buildings 5 to 10 times more efficient, and cars also 5 to 10 times more efficient. It'll take a little time to accomplish all that efficiency, but that's why I said 30 to 50 years. So I think we can have a better economy, and we should have a more just economy, but leaving that question aside, we can have a growing economy and less energy consumption, which is completely supplied by renewable energy sources, 100%.
And what would that mix be?
Well, that depends on how we arrange our research and what our priorities. I'll tell you what my ideal mix is. If we do the right research, we would have a significant component of wind energy, but not a huge component of wind energy, because wind energy is mostly concentrated in the Midwest, where we don't have a lot of people, and you need a lot of transmission lines to get it to the people. So we would have a good chunk of wind energy, which is economical today, and that's where we should be investing. We would have a very large chunk of solar photovoltaics, and I think of parking lots as one of our biggest resources, and I hope you'll show pictures of parking lot solar PV. Because it's at a scale that's intermediate, that can be made economical. It's large enough to be economical, but it's right there where the consumption is. So you don't need the transmission lines. Now, solar photovoltaics, solar cells are a little more expensive than they should be, but it's the only major energy source that's rapidly becoming cheaper. All the other energy sources, because of increasing prices of copper and raw materials, are getting more expensive. So efficiency in solar is actually moving up in the feasibility scale, and other sources of electricity, nuclear, coal, even wind is becoming somewhat more expensive because of the cost of raw materials. I think we should emphasize, and then there's solar thermal power plants and the solar thermal water heaters and water heating, and good design of buildings. I think those are very important energy sources. We can have centralized solar thermal power plants in the Southwest. We already have some actually in California from the 1980s. They work quite well. We should use some biofuels, gaseous fuels derived from biofuels, as standby in natural gas power plants. We can convert them to renewable fuels, so when the sun isn't shining and so on. So the renewable sources are supplemented by some forms of storage, existing dams. We don't need new dams, but we can use existing dams much better than we're doing. We can use some biofuels to support the system, and we can use batteries and ultracapacitors for electricity storage. And one big thing that we're not doing at all very well, which is still mostly in university laboratories, is direct production of hydrogen from solar energy. So there are many different ways to do that, and I think that needs to be emphasized and commercialized, because without that we will need a large component of biofuels. I am not at all in favor of ethanol from corn and turning food into fuel. We're using fuel to grow food, and to turn food back into fuel is really not sensible. I mean, it's done us some good to show that you can make fuel out of other organic materials, but we should be using organic material that we think of today as weeds, because weeds are a nuisance because they capture solar energy very efficiently, and they do so on land where nothing else will grow. So you can actually think of aquatic weeds like water hyacinths and duckweed, of microalgae, You can actually capture carbon dioxide emissions from coal-fired power plants in algae. It has been demonstrated, and then you can turn those into liquid fuels. And ultimately, whenever you burn biomass, you can capture that CO2 and turn it into liquid fuels. So, to give you a short answer, the main energy sources would be solar in various forms, wind mainly with large turbines, some solar hydrogen if we can make it work, and some component of biofuels. And biofuels should be minimized because the land area requirements get pretty large, and that would have some environmental impact.
Okay, and then what about this would be, you're focusing on the United States, or are you talking about a global effort?
Well, I focus my study on the United States, carbon-free and nuclear-free for the United States. Most studies are like survey studies, and I wanted to really do a technically thorough demonstration that it can be done here in the largest energy economy in the world. Now, we do have, the U.S. is really blessed with immense renewable resources. North Dakota, South Dakota, Texas, Montana, each one of these states has more wind energy potential than all of the nuclear power plants output combined. Each one of these states has more wind energy potential. And the other reason I focused on the United States is in the sense, it is the essential country. If the United States does not make a commitment to renewable energy sources, you cannot begin to have a sensible conversation with China and India. You need this, we need this urgently, not just because the climate change problem is urgent and we need to make our contribution to it as the biggest CO2 polluters on the planet, at least in per capita terms are among the biggest, but we need to do this because China is, pretty much the same CO2 emissions or greenhouse gas emissions as the United States today or soon to be. They will not sit down and talk seriously until the U.S. does this. So I think showing that it can be done, the first step for the U.S. to do it is to show that it won't destroy the economy, it won't burn a hole in the pocketbook, that when you flip the switch, the lights will come on. And it's been very interesting what's happened since the publication of my study. We published a newsletter in which there's a diagram of an electricity grid, and I hope you will show that, because it really is a unique thing in this study. It's the first time, to my knowledge, that anyone has published a diagram of an electric grid showing the components of an all-renewable electricity system that would be reliable. And I set out to answer 3 questions. Is it feasible to get rid of fossil fuels and nuclear power, produce a reliable energy system? Can we do it without purchasing offsets from other countries? That is, we continue to emit CO2, but we'll save CO2 emissions in some other country. And can we do it at reasonable cost? And the Nuclear Energy Institute, which promotes nuclear power, as you know, rather vigorously with multi-million-dollar budgets, they did a blog on my study, or the summary, in which they reproduced those 3 questions, and they said, well, the answer to is it feasible is yes. So they don't disagree that we can get rid. The answer to can we do it without offsets is yes. And then we're arguing about cost. Okay, but at least we have even the most severe critics who would not agree with me on many things, they agree that this is technically feasible. So I'm very glad about that.
I wanted to just briefly ask you about 2 things that often come up in energy discussions.
Right.
One is the specter of peak oil.
Yes.
And the other is the idea of zero-point energy, or energy from the vacuum.
Energy from vacuum, I don't think so. Peak oil is a more complicated problem. I don't subscribe to the peak oil theory. in the following sense. I think we already have run out of environmental room to burn a lot more fossil fuels. So the peak oil problem is actually, if we get peak oil, if we already have conflict over oil, we have wars over oil, but there's no demonstration that it's actually peak oil. In my opinion, oil is still pretty cheap to produce in the Persian Gulf. The price of oil is many times bigger than the cost of producing oil. It's other factors that are keeping the price of oil very high. They said the same thing in the 70s, and then the price of oil collapsed in the 80s. I don't think the price of oil is likely to collapse again, because China and India are growing very fast, and there's a demand pull, and there's all the insecurities, and there's a security price on oil. Also, at $60 a barrel, you can convert coal into oil. The Canadians are ripping apart large sections of their country, converting tar sands into oil. There's even larger oil shale resources. It's the environment to produce liquid fuels. We're short of environment. The capacity of the environment to bear the insults in our quest for liquid fuels is what's short, because there's plenty of ways to produce liquid fuels to fuel cars. We're doing it with ethanol, right? So you can produce ethanol in a lot of different ways, including some fairly destructive ones. So I don't believe that there is a crisis around the capacity of the world to produce liquid fuels to fuel cars, because that's a lot of the peak oil theory, that we're going to get into this gigantic economic crisis because oil prices will skyrocket because production is going to start going down. When oil prices skyrocket, as they have done, really, they've gone up from $20 and $30 a barrel to $60, $70, and $80 a barrel just in 5 years. That's skyrocketing by historical standards. Civilization hasn't collapsed. People are hardly driving less. It hasn't impacted. And at $80 a barrel, at $60 a barrel, you can convert all of these other resources into oil, which are very plentiful. So I think if you look at the climate change problem, we've already obviously crossed some thresholds, and we don't know how severe they are. The evidence is in. We have put the plan, as my friend Helen Caldecott, who raised the money for this and sponsored this and essentially really had the vision for this, said is the planet is in intensive care. And it's not an intensive care because of peak oil. It's an intensive care because we've already burned too many fossil fuels.